African Ascent is particularly privileged, and should I say, the producer, namely myself, is extremely excited to share with you the situation in Brazil as we talk about the religious dimension in Brazilian everyday life. My guest tonight, who is currently a fellow at the Hutchins Center, is an assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department. She offers courses in the areas of social justice, human rights, the law, and the African diaspora, including African Americans and the legal process, racial violence, colonial times to present, and African diaspora theory. Dr. Boaz previously taught in the Law, Politics, and Society Department at Drake University, Des Moines, Iowa. Dr. Boaz brings a unique combination of expertise in law, legal theory, and Africana studies to the department. She has a PhD in history with a specialization in Africa, the African diaspora, and the Caribbean from the University of Miami. A JD with a concentration in international law from the University of Toledo, and an LLM in intercultural human rights from St. Thomas University. She is also a licensed attorney in the state of Florida and practiced law in Miami for several years before transitioning to a career in academia. Dr. Boaz, I hope I'm saying the name correctly. If I'm not, please forgive me. Plans to seek admission to the bar in North Carolina and use her legal experience to help students engage with pro bono civil rights work in the Charlotte area. Her research focuses on the structural racism ingrained in domestic and international mechanisms protecting civil, political, social, and cultural rights. The bulk of her work addresses the legal proscription of African cultural practices in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the modern-day impact of those laws on public perceptions of these practices. She has published articles about linguistic rights for Creole speakers, as well as broad overviews of the history of the proscription and prosecution of African religions in the Western Hemisphere. Her talk tonight, for example, will dissect a dimension, a facet of these practices. One of her more recent articles examined the use of the term voodoo in a U.S. court proceedings regarding divorce, child custody, and insanity. Her current book project explores the boundaries of legitimate spiritual practices, extremely important, legitimate spiritual practices in the Anglophone Atlantic world from the 1850s to the 1950s. Her research integrates British colonial proscriptions of African diaspora religions in the Caribbean and Africa into a more well-established studies of the legal prohibition of astrology, spiritualism, and pretended witchcraft in the US and Britain during this particular period. She was invited to participate in 2 selective summer workshops to develop this project: the Junior Scholars Law and Humanities Workshop, hosted by Columbia Law School, and the Institute of Constitutional History's Summer Research Seminar, hosted by Stanford Law School. What a rich bio. I'm looking forward to learn from you. You have so much to teach. So why don't we begin for the purposes of informing the diverse demographics of this great city of Melrose in which I live, and give you an opportunity to introduce Brazil. Where is it? How old is it? What is the population? And so on. You can present it in any way you want. Let's begin with that.
Certainly. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about my research on Brazil. So Brazil is a country in South America. Its population is about 97 million people. And at this time, Brazil is really important when we talk about the history of people of African descent, in particular, African diaspora religions. many people don't realize that the United States was not actually the primary recipient of enslaved persons in the Atlantic slave trade. In fact, Brazil was the primary recipient. It received over 45% of the Atlantic slave trade, of all the persons trafficked in the Atlantic trade. And today, more than 50% of the population of Brazil actually identifies as people of African descent. Incredible, right?
Wow. About 4.8 million people of African descent landed in Brazil,
Correct.
constituting the current 45% of the population.
Correct.
Some even contend 50%.
Right, which would be, just to give a little perspective, about 10 times the number of enslaved persons that landed in the United States.
Incredible.
Yes.
That's a huge number.
It's a huge number. It's a huge number. And so, of course, with them, enslaved persons, they brought their culture, their heritage, their oral traditions, their religious traditions. And in the New World, in the Americas, they formulated new practices based on those African beliefs and rituals. And so these are the bodies of religions, of spiritual practices that my work touches upon. And we're generally going to call them Afro-Brazilian religions. Most often, the religions that we're talking about are Candomblé and Umbanda. They're two of the primary faiths built upon the beliefs of people of African descent in Brazil.
I'm fascinated even by the names, and I'm sure my audience would like to know more about these practices. Describe them for us. What exactly happens at these spiritual domains?
Well, it's a little difficult in general in the African diaspora, meaning in places outside of the African continent where people of African descent live, where people with African heritage live. It's a little difficult to generalize spiritual practices. And the reason that it's difficult is because the vast majority of these faiths, and we're talking about a number of different religions, from Santeria Lucumi, which is predominantly from Cuba, Orisha worship in Trinidad, to Candomblé and Umbanda in Brazil, Vodou in Haiti. We're talking about decentralized faiths, faiths that don't have some figure at the top, like a pope, to tell all of the practitioners, this is how you worship, right? So practices, beliefs, they can vary a lot among different communities. So I guess the first thing to kind of say about these religions is that they're divided up into different communities, different houses, different spiritual families. In Brazil, these communities, or the places where they gather, are referred to as terreiros, which is just kind of a site of worship. And it can vary in size and numbers of members, length of existence, a number of different things.
Incredible. Pardon my ignorance, but I would like to know slightly more. Do these spiritual practices take place inside bricks, churches, and stones, or do they also take place in individual households? What do the practitioners of these spiritual practices typically worship?
I don't know that there is a typical place of worship. As I said, in Brazil, we're typically talking about spaces called terreiros. They can be separate from the places where people live,
Yes.
like a church would be or a
Yes.
mosque would be. However, often, well, I don't necessarily want to venture so far as to say often, but in some cases, in particular, the leaders of these religious communities, as well as certain members, might live in the same place where people worship.
That's what I was thinking. That's what I learned from the report, which I read as carefully as I could. And it took me back to Western African religious practices.
Absolutely.
In which worshiping practices, sometimes take place inside households.
Absolutely.
One doesn't have to go to church to pray. There are statues and statuettes inside the homes, that the worshippers worship. This people of African descent in Brazil also brought some of these practices to Brazil.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, in terms of bringing actual representations of
Yes.
religion, that's something that generally wasn't possible because enslaved populations, when they were coming to the Americas, they weren't able to physically bring things with them. So they brought with them ideas, visions, understandings of the world around them. And these ideas, as they have developed over time and as they are practiced and followed today, often do include the use of various types of objects for religious worship.
That's what I was thinking.
And
Yeah.
some people use statues
Yes.
or some kind of, there's no great translation or explanation, but
Yes.
some kind of perhaps shrines
Yes.
that are considered to be representations of
Precisely.
spirits or deities that are worshipped in these faiths.
This is particularly true, for example, among the worshippers of the Orisha tradition, among the Igbos. A famous philosopher who continues to teach at NYU, I think, has written extensively on these Igbo practices. So when I was reading the report, I couldn't help but visually think in terms of the importation of some of these practices from West Africa directly to Brazil, which of course is going to lead to the center of our discussion, this phenomena of intolerance that is often practiced against non-dominant practices that are first otherized. They are first otherized, then the intolerances are justified as a function of tolerating the strange, the barbaric, the primitive, the inferior, and so on. Which leads me now to ask you to give us a working definition of what you mean by religious intolerance. Take your time, develop the idea so that our viewers will be informed by you.
Sure. Well, I think before we get to a definition of religious intolerance, maybe we need to rewind a little bit and talk a little more about the beliefs that some of these faiths center
That's
on.
wonderful.
So you mentioned the concept of orishas, which is one of the belief systems centered on the veneration or worship of spirits or deities or entities known as orishas, are actually one of the most prevalent types of religious practice in the Americas. And it comes from
Throughout the Americas.
Throughout the Americas, yes. And it comes from predominantly an empire known as the Oyo Empire that was partially located in what's now modern-day Nigeria, and encompassed primarily a group of people who we now refer to as the Yoruba people, who are located in southwestern Nigeria and also a little bit into Benin and Togo. And these individuals, they weren't necessarily the dominant groups, the dominant ethnic groups coming in the Atlantic slave trade. However, the Oyo Empire, it collapses toward the end of trading across the Atlantic. And so the people of the Oyo Empire, they end up being sold in large numbers toward the end of the Atlantic slave trade. And this is one of the reasons why we find their practices to be very dominant in places like Cuba and Brazil and Trinidad, as well as now as populations have migrated from South America and the Caribbean to the United States, they're also practiced here. And the orishas, they're a difficult concept to explain. And I often tell people, I'm a scholar of religious studies as well as law, and I often say to people, it will be a great day when we can speak about Africana religions on their own terms without having to compare it to something else so that people can understand this is the concept that we're speaking about. But I don't think we're there yet.
I see.
And so to understand the orishas, oftentimes people will make a comparison to Greek and Roman mythology. And the idea that there are these entities, these deities, these beings with great power that are also seen as an embodiment of various elements of our universe. So, for example, there is an Orisha Shango who is worshipped throughout the African diaspora, throughout the Americas. And in most contexts, people associate him with things like thunder and lightning. He's often seen as an Orisha associated with justice as well.
And he's invariably a he.
Um, there are
or
many.
Is that an assumption on my part?
I'm trying to think of a context in which Shango is not a he. I can't think of any at the moment, but it is a characteristic of some Orishas that they have different roads or manifestations that can be either male or female.
Okay.
We don't necessarily always see the same gender binaries that we see in other religions.
Correct.
Right. So these Orishas, they are basically manifestations also of something known as Ashe, which is an energy that runs throughout our universe. It exists in everything. It exists in the chairs that we're sitting on, the floor beneath us. It exists in plants and animals in the sky, as well as the ancestors, human beings, and all the deities, all the spirits, all the entities that we worship.
It's incredible. This reminds me in a very inventive way of the function of the imperishable in Hindu practices. Brahman, who is also called Akshara, and sometimes the imperishable, the infinite, is also existent in all external objects and human beings themselves. It's remarkable.
It's actually, I would say, a rather widespread belief among many, especially minority religions, that there is this kind of energy that connects everything in the universe.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we also have to remember that for centuries, long before the colonization of Africa, there was trade and movement of persons across the Indian Ocean between India and East Africa. And we don't know exactly how deep into the continent these ideas may have penetrated. We may have had originally some ideas about the formation of the universe that came from West Africa and traveled all the way to India, or vice versa.
Well, if we include Egypt into the matrix, it happens to be one of my research specializations. Then the origin of the universe for the Egyptians is what they call Nun, which is metaphorically water-like, something dynamic, something that flows, something that is forever. And this insight, of course, was popularized among the Egyptians about 3500 BC, long before the Upanishads, in which Akshara, the Brahman, the imperishable, which I spoke about earlier, plays a similar function. But this takes place around 850 BC. So chronologically, we begin with Egypt, I suppose, and then there are parallel civilizations, India, China, and so on. And then, of course, West Africa a little bit later. But Ashe, I think, is something like Ashe might have probably been absent and present in Egypt. I haven't done the research very carefully. Right. That's wonderful.
Absolutely. So I bring this up just because if we're going to talk about intolerance...
No, you did it well, very well.
Thank you.
Yes.
But I think it's important to understand a little bit about the religions that we're dealing with, and maybe some of the reasons why people might find these faiths to be a little strange, a little unfamiliar, and to understand also a little bit about the ways in which these faiths can be targeted.
Absolutely. You did it extremely well, because I shot the analytic question prematurely. And then you very gently and skillfully contextualized it in describing the ontology, the structure of the practices themselves, before we begin speaking about otherizing them. Now, I think, thanks to you, the time is ripe now for us to move the centerpiece of your research, the idea of religious intolerance.
Absolutely.
Now I think we can go definitions.
Absolutely. So my research is actually, it is based on religious intolerance, but there's a term that I've started using
Yes.
that I learned, I suppose, about a year and a half or 2 years ago now, as I was first starting to do research on religious intolerance in Brazil. And that term is religious racism. It's a term that's frequently used by activists in Brazil or by practitioners of Afro-Brazilian religions to describe the specific intolerance against their faiths. And it's built on this idea that religious intolerance is not all the same, and it's not all driven by the same motives. In particular, religious racism is driven by, as one might assume with the term racism in there, is driven by racial bias as well as religious intolerance. So in the case of African diaspora religions, we're talking about discrimination not only against any religion that's different, but against particularly religions that are derived from Africa and or from Black people.
I see.
So there's an idea that there's still a certain bias that's hanging on against cultural, spiritual, religious practices from the continent of Africa.
Incredible. I'm now titillated analytically for the following reason. So what you're doing is, correct me if I'm wrong, you're distinguishing the idea of tolerance, which is quite natural. Human beings are not necessarily always tolerant, from a specific kind of tolerance that you're contending has something to do with the race idea.
Yes. Yes.
I see.
At the risk of getting a little confusing with the conversation, we have to kind of rewind to what we first started talking about in terms of the landscape of Brazil.
Okay.
So we remember that Brazil received many, many more enslaved Africans than the United States, and that their population is now self-identified as more than 50% people of African descent. So race operates very differently in Brazil than it does in the United States.
I see.
We don't have what we famously in the US have called one-drop rules. This idea that people are separated by sort of historically, we would have used the terms colored and white, right? The people can't be divided in Brazil by if you have the tiniest percentage of African heritage and no percentage of African heritage. Because if we were to look for people who had no African heritage in Brazil, there would be almost no one.
Incredible.
Right. I mean, of course, with the exception of a small percentage of the population and recent immigrants from perhaps Europe and other places. But the vast majority of the population, especially people who have been there for several generations, will be able to tell you stories of, oh, my grandmother or my great-grandmother was Black, even if they physically, phenotypically appear white according to US standards.
This is incredible. So this concept must have excited Henry Louis Gates and his research project. I'm sure you had this conversation with him.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And I know he's done some work on the Afro Latin America, and
Yes.
Brazil is just such a unique place, even within Latin America.
Amazing. It will be the most right place for his DNA testing.
Yes, of
That
course.
is what I'm
Yes,
trying
of
to
course.
yeah, so that every Brazilian could trace his ancestors back to something, for lack of a better term, African/Black.
Most likely, yes.
Wow.
Yes. But so with this concept that we can't have this one-drop rule, we can't have this white versus non-white binary in Brazil, we have to start dividing people, or people rather divide themselves along different lines. And so one of the things that people in Brazil have started talking to me about, and this is not to suggest that, okay, let me rewind for one moment and say that just because we can't have discrimination based on white versus non-white. It's not to suggest that there's no racial discrimination in Brazil
That's
based
where
on
I was
phenotype.
going to go. So I'm
Absolutely
glad
not.
you began rewinding.
In fact, racism in Brazil is notoriously rampant. People who are extremely dark-skinned and who have phenotypical features that we would typically associate with people of African descent, they experience levels of discrimination that I would argue probably exceed what we even know in the United States.
This is consistent, Danielle. I'm glad you verified this with what my students, my Brazilian students at Berklee College of Music, have been telling me. I won't give you names. In fact, when I told them that I'll be interviewing you, their eyes beamed, and they are so happy that racism, as they put it in Brazil, finally is going to be discussed openly. Because some of them, without giving me a name, one particular student, absolutely brilliant, has distinct African features that I recognized. And he himself told me that those who raised him had to hide this fact from him. And additionally, he's also gay. So you can imagine the intersectional form of discrimination that could take place in that setting in Brazil. I hope I'm right.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. I mean, we have all the typical features of racism in the United States that also are operating in Brazil.
Yes.
Access to education is limited for racial minorities. Over-incarceration, discrimination in policing, police brutality, disparities in terms of access to water, to clean water, electricity, food, all of the features that we would typically think of as being facets of racism, forms, aspects of racism in the United States are also present, and probably in most cases actually more problematic, more present.
And this is remarkable, Daniel, because almost 50% of the population is composed of people of African descent.
Right.
So you would think that they would run the show. As in the South African situation, if I may make parallel moves.
South Africa is a very complicated comparison with, of course, the history of apartheid and segregation and things of that nature. But
it's the demographics that is just shocking me.
It is shocking. But when we think about most countries in the Americas, with, I would say, the only possible exception of Cuba, there's never been any kind of meaningful reparations, meaningful upset to the system of oppression that was slavery. And so if you have the majority of your population of African descent coming to Brazil as enslaved persons, laboring on plantations, otherwise being subjugated to systems of oppression, and this happens for hundreds of years. And then one day, which incidentally, Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. So in 1888, by this point, people of African descent in Brazil are free. But free to what? And so if there's never any meaningful system of ensuring that they become equal economically, politically, socially with the people who used to own them, then what is to improve their situation over time? And so what we've seen throughout the Americas is that there's been a difficulty of moving out of positions of poverty, moving out of subjugation, moving out of systems of oppression over time. And that's, I would say, a near universal experience for people of African descent in the Americas. But in Brazil in particular, there's also questions of colorism, and there's also the problem of people trying to find other ways to define race than just talking about skin color, so that people who are dark-skinned are able to move ahead, right? And so one of the things that that my colleagues in Brazil have been speaking about is that religion has become one among many of the defining factors to determine someone's racial identity.
Wow.
So, for example, I always like to use myself as kind of an example, a guinea pig,
Yeah.
because I have this look that's kind of racially ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I self-identify as a person of African descent because I'm from the United States, and here we have this one drop rule, and unquestionably, I would be colored, I would be other, I would be non-white here, right? But if someone like me travels to Brazil, because they have such a large population of people who look like me and are
Yes.
darker than me, I come sort of in on a different spectrum of race, right? So I'm
Incredible.
not quite white.
And you're
I'm
not
definitely
quite
not black. I'm something in the middle, right? And so a number of things might change where I fall on that spectrum. If, believe it or not, if I go out and I have a really dark tan at some point, that could push me in the direction of blackness. But more so, if I had distinctly African features,
Which you don't.
which I don't, that could push me in the direction of being black, more so, or just as much as my skin color.
I see.
The texture of my hair, if it were more African in texture, then that would also potentially push me in the direction of blackness. But then, and I can't necessarily say how recently this has been a phenomenon, but I can say that today, religion is also something that can define someone's blackness.
That's remarkable.
So, in the sense that if I, looking exactly as I do, am also a practitioner, a devotee of an Afro-Brazilian religion, that makes me more black and more prone to discrimination than someone who is, for example, Christian.
Well, I'm sure you've been told this before, since we're speaking in intimate terms now. When I first saw you at the Hutchins Center from a distance, I actually thought you were an Ethiopian. Have you been told this before? You're very Ethiopian looking.
I've been told just about everything under the sun. There's an interesting tendency, I think, wherever I travel or whomever I'm interacting with, people like to assume that I'm one of their own.
Yeah.
And so when I'm in Brazil, I mean, to be fair, I do look Brazilian, but people often assume that I'm from there.
That's what I thought. Remember before the interview, I asked you if you're from Brazil, because I assumed that you are. I also assumed that you might be an Ethiopian, Semitic Ethiopian, that is, because we have the Semitic and non-Semitic Ethiopians. The majority of Ethiopians, in fact, do not have Semitic features, but a few do. You have a Semitic feature. I would also, within the Ethiopian context, have a Semitic feature, for example. So you're quite right to think that you're an African, because an Ethiopian is an African.
Absolutely.
If you look Ethiopian, therefore you must necessarily be African. So your self-conception is quite laudable. Now, so the argument is within the American context that you'd be considered black.
In the United States.
In Brazil,
definitely.
you'd be considered ambiguous.
Yes. And people would evaluate, I would be considered ambiguous based purely on physical
features.
characteristics.
Yes.
So other things, cultural, social, spiritual characteristics, are what are going to move me around on that sliding
Incredible.
scale.
As you contended, if they can't do it through skin colors, they have now identified religion as a marker, as a signifier, as an identifier.
As one of them, yes.
Amazing.
Absolutely. So this is a bit of a drawn out version, a bit of a detailed version of why people who practice Afro-Brazilian religions will refer to discrimination against their faiths as religious racism. The other reason for the terminology is that throughout the Americas, throughout the history of this hemisphere, religions of African descent have been prohibited for hundreds of years sometimes. In the case of the British Caribbean, for example, we have a concept called obia that most people, I think, in the United States have never heard of a term like this. But basically, it's a term that develops to refer to predominantly African spiritual practices in British colonies in the Americas. So we're talking about places like Jamaica and Barbados, Antigua, Trinidad, places of this nature.
I have been to these places, so I have images of them. Yeah.
And by 1760, the British started passing laws prohibiting the practice of obia. And typically they don't attempt any definition of obia, but they say any profession of spiritual practice, of spiritual power, can be obia. And in practice, people were prosecuted for engaging in African spiritual rituals. And so these laws actually are still in place in many former British colonies in the Caribbean, including Jamaica. Trinidad and Tobago being one notable exception, and there are a couple of others. But by and large, these laws are still in place. Later, in places like Cuba, in places like Brazil, places like Haiti, similar laws develop. In Brazil, in 1890, there was a law passed, and this is just 2 years after emancipation. There's a law passed that basically says that religions of African descent are a threat to public health. A threat to public health. And so they're widely prosecuted for many years until the mid-20th century. Artifacts, Afro-Brazilian religious ceremonies are raided by the police. And artifacts of those religions, religious instruments, musical instruments, sacred drums, and other things of that nature are dragged into the streets and sometimes burned in huge bonfires. Sometimes they're confiscated by police officers. And actually, some of them still exist in police museums, especially in the state of Rio de Janeiro. They've held on to these seized artifacts, these religious artifacts, these musical instruments that were seized back in the late 19th and early 20th century, and refused to return them to the religious communities they were stolen from, or to put them in some kind of museum or anything of that nature. And so it's also kind of drawing on or reflecting on this history of the widespread prohibition of African diaspora religions that leads to this terminology of religious racism. This idea that intolerance in the present day is derived from, is coming from this history of legal prohibition.
So it appears, as if, correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're describing to me seems to be the following. First, a given religious practice is defined in a particular way. And the definition, and the one who does the definition makes sure that that which he is defining is in some shape or form inferior, not only different, but inferior to one's own familiar religious practice. If one is a Catholic, he or she invariably thinks that everything that non-Catholics do, by definition, is not only different, but somehow inferior, somehow subordinate, somehow unhealthy in medical terms. And in that, unless it is stopped, it's going to contaminate the cultures of the dominant place. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. And I think it's important. I mean, scholars know this very, very well, but it's often not quite understood by the general public that concepts like voodoo, like obia, which is kind of the British Caribbean version of voodoo. Yeah. Concepts like this are very closely tied to scientific racism.
Amazing.
They're closely tied to the idea that as races exist in this hierarchy, right, so do religions. And they exist in that way because the religions of African people, of course, belong to a supposedly inferior people.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's where the notion that Africans practice this fetish worship comes
Yes.
from. This idea that they pray to objects and trees and other inanimate objects. And this is a way in which religions were sort of
Hierarchized. Yeah.
hierarchized.
Yeah.
Sure.
We'll create a term for that. Yes.
And if we remember, if we go back to talking about these religions, what's actually happening is this very widespread belief that there's an energy that runs through everything. So maybe a person of African descent looks like they're praying to a tree.
Yes.
But they're praying to the energy in that tree, right? They look like they're talking to a stone and maybe leaving some kind of offering for the earth. But they're not worshiping that stone or that tree or the earth. They're worshiping the energy, the spirit, the ashe that resides there.
Precisely, as
Right.
you said earlier. Yeah. Remarkable.
However, during this era of scientific racism, it was widely said and believed that Africans had this more primitive form of religion
Yes.
that was fetish worship. And that over time, as religion evolved, as people evolved, they would grow toward monotheism, right? And so during that era, there's this hierarchy of religion established based on who believes, who worships in what way, and African religions are placed at the bottom of that hierarchy. And over time, in the process of gaining certain civil and political rights, we've never quite brought religion up to the level of other faiths.
You're so right. This reminds me too of a chapter in my book on a 17th century Ethiopian philosopher by the name of Zara Yacob, who is considered to be one of the founders of modernity, modern philosophy, who reports two things. One, that when the Jesuits came to Ethiopia in the 17th century to evangelize, they came to evangelize with the understanding that the full-blown, mature, ancient Ethiopian Christianity, the Christianity that gave Europe a glimpse of Christian ideas, was not sufficiently sophisticated, and in that Ethiopians had to be rebaptized. And of course, they managed to brainwash one particular Ethiopian emperor at the time and introduce Catholicism to Ethiopia. During this time, there was this philosopher, Zara Yacob, as I mentioned, who resisted the Jesuits, fled from his house in the middle of the night, exiled himself in a cave for 2 years, and wrote a masterpiece, which came to be the philosophical work in which the vision of modern philosophy is being articulated, which I shared with the world in the form of a book that I wrote about 10 years ago. That's one. And secondly, even after the book was published, the Portuguese, the Italians in particular, convinced themselves that this rational modern philosophy that is being articulated in Ethiopia cannot conceivably be produced by an Ethiopian. And they constructed an Italian who had spent some time in Ethiopia to have actually been the author of this book. So what you're sharing with me reminds me of this. Mind you, this is within the context of an Ethiopia which has never been colonized. So you can just imagine the fate of our West African brothers and sisters whose fate was to be subjected to this process of inferiorization, and precisely because of the taint of slavery. That was going to be one of the questions that I was going to ask you. I wonder if the situation in Brazil would have been different if these Africans who landed in Brazil were not enslaved. I wonder, would they have accepted them as human beings who could be socialized to become Catholics and Protestants and treat them differently, do you think?
It's so difficult to speculate about something that would shift the
racial gaze.
Entire history of the world, frankly. But I think they would not have respected them if they had not been enslaved.
Nevertheless,
because first of all, we see how Europe itself had so much infighting just between Protestants and Catholics.
Exactly.
Or between Muslims and Christians.
Given the same skin color, yes.
And so there's a long history of othering, vilifying people of different religions.
So then, let me ask you then philosophically, would it be correct then to draw a possible conclusion that intolerance then is simply a dimension of the human condition?
Unfortunately, that may be the case. That may be the case because people are always looking for some way to other.
Precisely. Have you noticed? Yes. If it's not race, it is class. If it's not class, it's gender. If it's not gender, it's sexuality. If it is not sexuality, it is disability in its varied forms. The practice of intolerance seems to be continuous.
Absolutely.
And then, as you were eloquently arguing, it also becomes the basis for racial bias.
Absolutely.
It just conveniently fits in.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's remarkable. And now, let's get to your tantalizing report. I read it, and the horrors of what you document there, I couldn't even read them. I couldn't believe that human beings are doing this to human beings. So you might want to isolate a few and describe them for us.
Sure.
And I'll be quiet.
I think that the most startling thing that's happening in Brazil right now that I think it's important for people to know about is that there's this phenomenon known as evangelized drug traffickers.
Evangelized
drug traffickers who are committing a lot of violence against devotees of Afro-Brazilian religions. Now, these evangelized drug traffickers, what am I talking about? So since I'm going to say at least around 2006 that I've read about, that I've documented, there's been this trend where the leaders of essentially drug trafficking gangs in Brazil's poorer communities, which historically have been referred to as favelas. In recent years, people have been pushing, some parts of society have been pushing more toward trying to identify them as comunidades or just communities, kind of signaling the fact that favela is a little bit of a derogatory term perhaps. But historically, these communities that have been called favelas, they're often dominated by at least one or two drug trafficking and other types of criminal gangs. And so since at least the early 2000s, some of the leaders of these drug trafficking gangs, especially in the state of Rio, have been converting to evangelical Christianity. And then they come back to their communities, to their gangs, their followers, and they kind of spread this conversion through their gang first. And then they tell all of their followers that part of their mandate, part of their control over their territory in these communities, in these favelas, is to push out all other religions. That the territory they control now belongs to Jesus. And so since the early 2000s, there's been kind of a spread of violence associated with the conversion of these drug trafficking gangs. And it started with restrictions on the practice of other religions in these communities that the traffickers control. So, for example, the wearing of white is a common symbol of Afro-Brazilian religions. And the traffickers will prohibit people from anybody from wearing all white in the communities they control.
We have about 5 minutes left, so.
Oh, goodness.
No, go ahead.
And it has escalated recently to the practice of completely shutting down Afro-Brazilian places of worship in the areas that the traffickers control. And it's also, so two things are happening. One is that the traffickers are going and they're threatening people. And they're going to Afro-Brazilian priests and they're saying, if you continue to practice this religion here, we'll kill you. And in August of this year, DECRADI, which is a specialized police force to deal with crimes of racial and religious intolerance, estimated that in the state of Rio de Janeiro alone, 200 places of worship, Afro-Brazilian places of worship, have been threatened or shut down by evangelized drug traffickers since the start of the year. 200. 200. And over recent history, we've seen a lot of violence coming from these drug traffickers as well. They have held priests at gunpoint and forced them to destroy their own places of worship, force them to overturn their own shrines, break their own sacred objects. They've urinated on places of worship. They've threatened people. They've committed all kinds of atrocities. And they've also themselves, the traffickers themselves, have gone in and set fire to places of worship. They've broken all of the religious artifacts in places of worship. And they've also, in a couple of instances, again, in the state of Rio, where this problem is the worst, they've taken over Afro-Brazilian temples, terreiros, as their headquarters. Wow. Yes. And they'll often put graffiti on the outside of the favelas they control or the outside of these buildings, these terreiros that they've turned into their headquarters, that will say something about Jesus is the owner of this place, or Jesus is Lord, or Jesus has the power. Yeah.
We only have 2 minutes left, if you can believe it. The interview has hardly begun.
Yes.
This was such a rich discussion. And of course, you're also a lawyer and an activist. Is there any particular message that you'd like to share with my viewers?
Absolutely. I would just like to say that you yourself can read more about the intolerance happening in Brazil if you visit our website, which is religiousracism.org. And we just today, actually, last Friday, actually, we just released a report and an interactive map of all the cases of religious intolerance that we have documented based on a variety of sources over the last about 20 years or so in Brazil. And so people are able to take a look at that and see some photos and videos and descriptions, analysis of the different acts of intolerance, and to gain a little more understanding of who are the victims, who are the perpetrators. And they can also send us a message, and we'll respond and talk with people further about what's happening in Brazil.
Incredible. This has been your host, Theodros Kiros, for African Ascent. Thanks for staying with us as we had this splendid interview with an emerging young theorist and scholar who is currently a fellow at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University.